The Ethiopian Bible does not call the Sahara a desert. In a Ge'ez manuscript tradition, preserved at the Highland monasteries, the word used for that stretch of land translates closer to the garden that was shut. Western editions never carried the passage. It survived only in liturgical Ethiopian sources, copied by scribes who treated it as history, not metaphor. The text names what grew there, it names what watered it, and it names, in a single deliberate verb, why it stopped. This is not a metaphor about faith drying up. This is a document that thinks the greening was real and the ending was chosen. In the Highland monasteries of Ethiopia, in the same liturgical tradition that preserved the Book of Enoch after Rome and Alexandria let it go, there is a manuscript cycle scholars refer to informally as the Green Testimony. It has never carried an official Western title because it has never appeared in an official Western Bible. The text is written in Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and its transmission history follows a pattern that will feel familiar to anyone who has traced Enoch's survival. Copied at Lalibela and Axum, recopied through the medieval period, catalogued by European travelers in the 19th century, then largely ignored because the material did not fit what the catalogers expected apocryphal literature to say. Dr. Getachew Haile, whose decades of work on Ethiopian manuscript collections remain the standard reference for Ge'ez textual studies, flagged this specific cycle in his survey notes as containing geographic material inconsistent with received cosmography. That is a careful scholar's way of saying the text describes a place that should not, according to everything else we've been told, have looked the way it says it looked. Here is the claim itself. The manuscript does not use the Ge'ez term for wilderness or wasteland when it refers to the land west and north of the highlands. It uses a word that translates more precisely as the shut garden, not empty ground, not land that was always dry, but a cultivated place that was closed. The distinction matters. You do not shut something that was never open. The text describes this land in the plainest terms available to it. Rivers that ran where no rivers run now. Groves planted in rows, dwellings clustered along water. It speaks of the land the way a person speaks of a home they once lived in, not a place they have only heard rumors about. And it does not stop at description. This is the part that unsettled the handful of scholars who worked closely with the manuscript. The text insists explicitly that the greening did not simply fade. It says the land was closed, not eroded, not exhausted by drought. Closed, the same way a door is closed, by someone, for a reason. That single distinction is why the passage never made it into any widely circulated translation. A gradual desert forming over centuries fits comfortably inside conventional geography. A garden that was deliberately shut does not. It demands a mechanism, it demands an actor, and it demands, eventually, an answer to the obvious question, closed by what and why. The manuscript does answer that question. It answers it with the same discipline Enoch uses when it names the single verb that releases a guardian from his post, specific, conditional, and deeply uncomfortable for anyone who prefers their sacred geography inert. But the text does not hand over that answer immediately. It does what these traditions always do. It builds the case for the garden first, what grew there, how it was watered, how people lived inside it, before it tells you what ended it. Because before you can understand a closing, the text insists, you have to understand what was worth closing. That is where the manuscript goes next, and where the descriptions stop being general and start naming specifics no invented geography would bother inventing. The manuscript gets specific in a way that surprised the researchers who first worked through it seriously. It names 3 tree types by their Ge'ez botanical terms. One identified by translators as a wild olive variant, one as a tamarind relative, one that remains disputed. It describes groves planted in deliberate rows along what it calls the standing water, language that implies permanent lakes, not seasonal pools. It describes cattle, not desert-adapted herds scraping by on scrub, but cattle kept, the way cattle are kept, where grass is reliable. It describes settlements with a level of domestic detail that reads less like myth and more like memory. Grain stores, fixed dwellings, not tents. paths worn between water sources, described as though the scribe, or whoever the scribe was copying, had walked them. None of this would matter if it were only a manuscript claim. It matters because the physical Sahara agrees with it. Rock art at sites like Tassili Niager in southern Algeria shows cattle herding scenes, swimmers and hippopotamuses, animals that require sustained open water, painted onto rock faces that now sit in one of the driest places on Earth. Sediment cores pulled from ancient lake beds beneath the modern dunes, the kind of work geoscientists like Stefan Kriepelin have spent careers on, show layered evidence of a lake system that once covered a significant portion of what is now empty desert. Chad's own geological record holds the same signature, a paleo-lake, mega-lake Chad, that at its largest rivaled the size of the Caspian Sea. None of that evidence comes from Ethiopia. None of it comes from scripture. It comes from sediment, from pollen counts, from rock carvings pecked into stone by people who had no reason to lie to anyone thousands of years later. Put the manuscript's language next to the geological record and the alignment stops feeling like coincidence. The text says groves. The pollen record shows tree cover. The text says standing water. The lake beds confirm it. The text says herded cattle. The rock art draws them, mid-stride, beside swimmers. This is where the manuscript stops sounding like folklore and starts sounding like testimony. A description written by, or transmitted from, people who were describing something they had actually seen or had been told about by people close enough to the memory that the details survived intact, which makes the next part of the text harder to dismiss, not easier, because if the garden was real, the closing has to be accounted for too. And the manuscript does not treat the closing the way modern climate science treats desertification, as a slow, impersonal drying. It treats it as an event, singular, named, attributable. The Ge'ez text has a specific word for what happened next, and the scholars who translated it were careful about how they rendered it into English, because the plain meaning is more deliberate than anyone expected a description of a climate change to be. The word is Sahara. Translators rendered it cautiously as withdrawn or sealed away, but Getachew Haile's working notes flagged a stronger sense buried in the root, something closer to turn the face from. The same idiom Ge'ez uses elsewhere for a deliberate act of abandonment, not a passive fading. It is not the verb Ge'ez uses for a well-running dry. It is the verb Ge'ez uses when a person decides not to look at something anymore. That distinction is the entire hinge of the passage. A well-running dry has no author. Something being sealed away has one. The text describes the closing in 3 stages, and it is careful, almost legalistic, about the order. First, it says, the water withdrew from the surface before it withdrew from the ground, as if the visible abundance were removed first, deliberately, while the deeper reserves lingered a while longer beneath. Second, it says the trees gave their fruit to dust, a phrase translators read as the groves, failing not from lack of water alone, but in step with something else leaving alongside the water. Third, and this is the line Haile flagged twice in his margins, it says the land was Sahara, because what dwelt in it was Sahara first. Read plainly. The manuscript does not say the land closed and the people left. It says something in the land was withdrawn first, and the land's closing followed it. The same sequence and nearly the same grammar Enoch uses when it says, the guardian's departure and the human's forsaking are not 2 events but 1 word spoken from 2 sides. Here, the manuscript uses the identical verb for both the unnamed presence and the land itself. Whatever left and the garden's shutting are described as a single act wearing 2 faces. The text lists conditions around this withdrawal, and they read less like poetry and more like a report. It happened, the manuscript says, only after a period it calls the long forgetting, implying duration, not a single failure. It happened only once, the paths between the waters were no longer kept, implying neglect of maintenance, not sudden catastrophe. And it happened finally only when, in the text's own phrase, no one remained who remembered why the garden had been given. Before this goes further, it's worth pausing on why that phrasing outlasted every attempt to soften it in translation. This is not a text blaming drought. It is a text blaming forgetting. a slow erosion of custodianship that preceded the physical erosion of the land itself, as though the greening required something from the people living inside it beyond simply living there. The manuscript does not linger on grief. It moves immediately into something closer to warning, and it widens its scope right at this point, because whatever Sahara means here, the Ethiopian text is not the only ancient record that describes a fertile land, going silent in almost exactly this shape. The correspondence starts with the science, because the science came first and asked no one's permission. Climatologists call the era. The manuscript seems to be describing the African humid period, a stretch running roughly from 11,000 to about 5,000 years ago, when shifts in Earth's orbital tilt pushed monsoon rains deep into what is now the Sahara. Cropoline sediment cores from Lake Yoa in Chad show the transition wasn't uniform decline either. The record shows the region held onto tree cover and open water for centuries after the monsoon rains began weakening, then crossed a threshold and dried with startling speed. A pattern paleoclimatologists still debate, some reading it as gradual, others, following work like Peter de Manical's Marine Core analysis, as an abrupt collapse compressed into a few centuries rather than a slow fade across millennia. Either way, real trees, real lakes, real herds, followed by a real and comparatively fast unraveling. That is not folklore. That is the peer-reviewed shape of the Sahara's last 5,000 years. Egypt's own textual record carries a parallel, and it comes from a civilization that watched the Western Desert directly. Old Kingdom expedition inscriptions, the kind catalogued in the Dakhla Oasis survey work, describe expeditions traveling routes west of the Nile that later became impassable. Administrative records casually assuming access to regions that, within a few dynasties, no longer supported the same travel. The Egyptians did not write a myth about a garden. They wrote logistics, and the logistics quietly stopped making sense once the land behind them changed. The third strand comes from the Sahara's own interior. Berber oral textual tradition, preserved in fragments collected by 20th century ethnographers among Tuareg communities, speaks of an ancestral time called Tenere Imazigen, roughly the desert that was not desert, describing a founding period of rivers and herds, followed by an event tradition, attributes not to weather, but to a broken obligation between the people and the land. Different language, different continents worth of transmission, the same shape, abundance, custodianship, a break, a silence. 3 records, a manuscript, a science, an oral tradition, using almost nothing in common except the sequence itself. Fertility. Then neglect, or a broken term of some kind. Then a withdrawal too complete to read as accident. Different vocabulary, same shape. And when 3 unrelated traditions converge on that shape without borrowing from each other, the question stops being whether the Sahara was once green, the sediment already settled that, and becomes something closer to what the Ethiopian text was actually trying to preserve. I'm not telling you the manuscript is a literal weather report, or that some conscious will reach down and seal the continent on purpose. The sediment cores don't need a sacred text to explain them, and the sacred text doesn't need the sediment cores to matter to the people who copied it for 1,000 years. What I am saying is narrower. 3 independent records, none aware of the others, describe the same sequence: abundance, a failure of keeping, then a closing too complete to call gradual. The Ge'ez manuscript is the only one of the 3 that gives that closing a grammar, a verb, and a warning. The garden was not lost. It was withdrawn from, in step with something that left it first. The dunes over Chad's Paleo Lake do not care what caused them. But the text that calls the land, the shut garden, was written by people who believed closings like that are never really about the water. They're about what stopped being kept.